Hello, Memoir Nation. I am Brooke Warner, and I am here to do a take for all things memoir, this time about Lindy West's new book, Adult Braces. I also want to note that I am wearing my Bay Area Baddie t shirt in honor of Lindy, who I've always loved. She's a fantastic writer. So, let me give a little bit of background about Lindy and her book, and then let's talk about the controversy and what is even going on. Lindy West is a very famous online feminist and influencer. She got her start in 2009 when she started working at The Stranger. And from there, she went to Jezebel in 2012. She wrote about feminism and fat positivity. She famously wrote about her abortion and why rape jokes aren't funny. I intersected with Lindy's time in all of those spaces because I was working at Seal Press at the time, which was a feminist publisher, also left coast based. And so I was following Lindy very closely during all of those years. And she was famous for a lot of reasons, namely just her fearlessness in terms of what she would write about. She was very relatable, especially to a whole generation of feminists. I'm a Gen Xer. She's a millennial, but we're only 6 years apart in terms of age difference. And so she was really speaking to young feminists during the 2010s. And so I will say about her, the most famous story that I remember was that after her dad died, some troll online made a fake Twitter account impersonating her dead father and just said the cruelest things about her from her father's account on Twitter. And she wrote about it and how hurtful it was. And then that interaction of writing about it being hurtful ended up leading to him writing to her and apologizing for his bad behavior, which was pretty profound. And then she later interviewed him about that for This American Life. And that just had kind of a profound effect and definitely made the news cycle. She's also famous for her show, Shrill, which you can watch on Hulu, which was based on her memoir by the same name. And now she's famous for having a polyamorous relationship, which is maybe not the thing you most want to be famous for, but there you go. And the thing is that the book is not so much about her polyamorous relationship, which she barely talks about until the very, very, very end when she just acknowledges that it's happening. But really, it's about how she got to the point of being okay with the fact that her husband wanted to be in a polyamorous relationship and ultimately got himself into one by getting a girlfriend and then ultimately the three of them becoming a throuple. So that's the story of the book. However, I do want to say that's like so little of what the book is actually about. Most of it is a road trip. Most of it is a critique on politics and America, the people in this country. It's curious, it's exuberant at times, it is funny. So I will say that I very much recommend the book. I laughed and I related. So, why is it getting so much negative attention? Well, that's the thing. I think that this book was just like on my to read list, and maybe it wouldn't have gotten kicked to the top of the pile if I hadn't started to read so much online about people being like, Lindy is in an abusive relationship. What is going on with her? A couple of weeks ago, Dan Savage wrote a piece about all of this, which was basically not addressing Lindy's book at all, but called Polly Under Duress. Lindy and Dan worked together at the Savage, and this was basically talking about how some people have polyamory thrust upon them. And then I read a Substack piece by the writer Leigh Stein, who I admire a lot, and she was talking about how basically it felt like Lindy is in an abusive relationship, and she was using her own abusive relationship from her younger years to talk about how she recognized it and why. And I read that and I related because I was also in an emotionally abusive relationship when I was in my 20s. And so I was very curious to read it and see what it was all about. So I read the book, and at face value, I really liked it. Based on what little I had read about it online, I was surprised that it was a travelogue more than anything. I laughed, I related, and running through the book, but not maybe as much as you'd think just from reading the reviews, is really Lindy making sense of the fact that her husband, Aham, who has always been open about wanting to be poly or being poly, is having a relationship with another woman named Roya. And then at the very, very end, she comes home and she is open to exploring what it might look like to be in a throuple. And so the road trip is sort of about what it takes to get there. So let's talk about why there is so much online discourse about this book. Like, why are people losing their shit? So, basically, now let me break it down. Number one, Lindy West is a very famous feminist from the 2010s. Like I said, I knew her work when I was at SEAL. She made a reputation for telling women that they didn't have to put up with men's bullshit. And so I think there's a little bit of that undergirding a lot of the discourse about what people feel like, is this Aham's bullshit? Does Lindy actually want to be in this relationship? I'll also say that people do have fraught feelings about polyamory. I mean, it's very interesting because there is certainly this whole discourse about polyamory being like normal or normalized. I also think that a lot of people act like they're okay with it. I mean, there's been so much conversation about like, I'm totally fine with what Lindy does or how she wants to live her life or if she wants to be in a throuple. But I think then once people start going very public about it, that is not so much the case. It's like people are okay with it as long as it's behind closed doors. And so I want to draw people's attention to the video that was put out, the three of them basically doing like a strip tease to disclose their polyamorous relationship, which I did find a little bit odd, especially since Lindy writes about this, not this in the book, but she writes about stripping, the idea of strip poker being like so foreign to her that it would be like dolphin ball, where like you're supposed to be a dolphin and they speak dolphin language. And she's like, I wouldn't ever do that. I would be so uncomfortable. And you feel her being very uncomfortable in this video, by the way. And so I think there's been some reaction to that. I actually know people who are loosely friends who are in a throuple. And I will say that people act like they're okay with that relationship and then talk a lot of shit about them behind their backs, or they're like, oh my God, I could never do that. And speculating a lot about how they sleep and where do people sleep and how does it work. So it is just like a thing where I think people intellectually they're okay with it, but then when they see it out in the real world, they have a lot of feelings around it. And I think that is definitely happening here with Lindy, as much as she's trying to put out into the world that she's totally fine with it. And then people think that Lindy is gaslighting herself. This is a big one. I will say that throughout the book, it absolutely feels like she's trying to justify that she is okay with what is going on, that she is trying to convince herself that she is totally cool with all of this. And it does feel hard to believe at times that she is totally cool with it. I mean, you can basically read her thought process and her self-hatred is coming to the fore, and she's sort of like, I have this hot husband and I either have to like get on board with this or not be with him. And so she's putting that out there, and of course people are going to have feelings about this. I do want to say that Jennifer Weiner wrote in her Substack something that I thought was really interesting, comparing Lindy to Liz Gilbert. And she says both West and Gilbert had brands that were built to a certain extent on the happiness of their relationships. The implied message that some fans and followers took from these loved up posts and sunny pictures, this too can be yours. And of course, she's totally right. I mean, I had some feelings after I read Liz Gilbert's most recent memoir that there was some hypocrisy, not so much in the memoir, but in the way that she had been living her online life. And then what you actually find out was really going on doesn't match that. And I think that's what's happening here for people with West as well. I want to say that I felt that way about Glennon Doyle too, in that she is trying to convince herself in Love Warrior that she could not and never would be a lesbian. And a few short years later, she's with Abby Wambach and they're married. And she's like one of the most famous lesbians in the world. And so sometimes you're just like that disconnect can be hard, but also FYI, I guess that is what it's like to really truly live out loud in the way that these kinds of authors do. It doesn't mean it's not annoying because it definitely can be. I also want to say that I'm reminded of Jill Cement's recent memoir, which was called Consent. In that book, we find out that some 30 years later, she actually understands that she was being controlled and manipulated by her husband when she wrote her first memoir, which was called Half a Life. And we interviewed Jill on the Memoir Nation podcast. So I will drop that in the link because it's just really interesting about what it means to reconsider a memoir. So there is precedent for memoirists trying to talk themselves into things in their memoirs, and then that is published, and then they kind of have to like go back and revisit that later. And I do have a feeling that's probably going to happen for Lindy here. I think the fourth thing, big reason that people are talking about this book right now has nothing to do with Lindy and everything to do with Aham, who post publication has exhibited some really shitty behavior. And that has been really poorly received. I think that Aham should have gotten media training. He wrote a scathing email to the Slate profile, Scaachi Koul, who posted the full letter online on her piece. And basically, that is the first thing you will see if you look up this story, is what Aham wrote to her. And so people are seeing that and not feeling great about him. Also, Lindy has erased her Substack post in which she talked about this and kind of defended her choices. And then she also erased an Instagram post in which she seemed surprised and angry about how the book was landing with readers. I will say, like, these are completely self-inflicted wounds, and post publication, like, I guess they should have gotten ahead of how people were going to feel about the book, especially given that Lindy already has a history with so much online hatred. And so it does feel like they're being reactive after the fact and stoking the flames and making things worse. The whole train wreck of the online part is probably ultimately good for book sales. I mean, some people are speculating that maybe it's all orchestrated and maybe she's doing it on purpose, and who knows. But unfortunately for Lindy, she's also too honest, because she also told Scaachi in the Slate profile, quote, "I need this book to be a success because everything's so scary. This has to float us for the next few years. I feel a pressure to take care of my family. And so, on this very cynical surface level, I would love for this book to be a success." That too makes people uncomfortable. It's basically leading to a lot of speculation that Aham is using Lindy for money. So I just now want to pivot to talk about my critique on the critique. Number one, too many people are weighing in on this book who have not read the book or who have not read the whole book. I have shared this before and I'll share it again because I do think it's really important. This stems from my own history. I read a review of Gina Frangello's book, Blow Your House Down. It was written by Dani Shapiro, who I admire. This was years ago. But basically, I took Dani's review and I just put it out into the world and said, this is why this book is problematic, without having read a single word of Gina's book. And then I got a lot of pushback from people, and rightfully so. And the first thing I did was I went and I read the book, and I loved the book. And then I issued a public apology for having said anything negative or disparaging about this book that I had not yet read. And I do feel that people are just so quick to jump into the fray and write, entire posts about this book that they have not read. The second thing is that this is a really, really well written book. And I can understand that Lindy would be frustrated by the response when she wants people to just care about the book and the craft and the writing. But unfortunately, the entire saga about the polyamory is completely eclipsing anything to do with the craft. West said of her own book in that same Slate profile, which again, I'll put in the links because it's a really good piece. But she said, "I worked harder on this than anything I've ever written or made." Her takes are smart. She is honest. People are eviscerating her for her honesty about herself and her mixed feelings about herself. But I find that quite cruel and honestly quite the double standard, because, this is just what it feels like to be a woman. I mean, like, we have our days where we don't feel good about ourselves and days where we do feel good about ourselves. People are mad at Lindy West for hating herself, but shit, she has gotten more than her fair share of hatred for years and years, and she has absorbed that. I remember reading Roxane Gay's Hunger, and I read it too long after it was published. And I had been a reader of hers for a long time. And when I read Hunger, I was shocked. I really was. And I don't know why, to read that Roxane wasn't like totally super confident and comfortable in herself. And of course she wouldn't be. She presents as a confident badass, so you can just take that at face value. But of course, there's lots of underlying feelings and emotions about, living in your body every day. And it's not just about your body, it's also just about the way that other people treat you. And then there's just being a woman in the world. And if you're a woman with strong opinions and you are putting yourself out there, there's a lot of backlash coming back your way. And this is obviously happening with Lindy, and this notion that, she can simultaneously be incredibly insecure and incredibly confident at the same time, I think is like one of the most normal experiences of women, the modern woman. So I just want to kind of say that in Lindy's defense. And then again, Scaachi speculates in the Slate profile, conjecture is inevitable, but let's say it's all exactly as she says it is. Why perform this kind of intimacy for such a cruel audience? And I think this is probably the best question of all, but I also think that this is the outcome of our modern obsession with people's lives. And the answer is probably that she couldn't help herself. Like, this is what she does. She's a writer. She is a writer of personal material. We're mad at her, I guess, for being so successful. She's a person who writes what she thinks, and this is what we are reading for. It's what we know her for. And she sees the world that has basically like shaped her, and we have all participated in that in a certain way. And then she puts it out there. She's so much a product of her generation, of feminism, of so many things. And then she just gets eviscerated, and we're sort of like, well, she has such a cruel audience, and some of that cruel audience are like people who read her and love her. And I think it's complicated too, because I think that some of the people who are really frustrated and angry and don't believe her are also probably her fans. I will say Lindy is a millennial, Liz Gilbert is a Gen Xer, but again, these books do feel similar because they're representative of a certain kind of woman. I should say a certain kind of white woman. I probably have to say I'm one of these women myself. I do see myself reflected in these kinds of books, but basically self-aware to the extreme, been in therapy or surrounded by therapy language. And so they have all of the right ways to talk about this stuff. And they're easily able to convince themselves of almost anything, intellectualizing their way into an answer that works for them. And I think this is how smart women get caught up in abusive relationships. Like I said, I was in one in my 20s. And I think it's because you think you're so smart. You think you have it figured out, and you intellectualize and you justify, and you can talk yourself into almost anything. And I certainly see that in these pages. And then also, like feminist. Lindy, Liz, me, others, we're feminist, and yet we are a product of this culture that will just crush you. It crushes you and lifts you up at the same time, and trying to navigate that is really complicated. And then they're both people pleasers. I'm not sure I completely relate to that one as much as you see them both talking about being people pleasers in this book or those books, but certainly Lindy West talks about being a people pleaser ad nauseum in this book. So look, Adult Braces is a great book. You should read it. If you weren't online at all, you probably would just read this book and then move on. It's really like Lindy, her past, who she is. It's that strip video. It's Aham's terrible behavior. It's her seeming to be broadsided by the reaction to this book and then taking down her posts. I am seeing that a lot of people are saying they want Lindy to be happy, and I feel that way too. I also think we're going to see another book from Lindy West, like 5 or 10 years from now, much in the same way that Jill Cement redid or, did a new take on her original memoir and wrote Consent, because I just think that there will be some record setting, like what I appreciated about that book was that it set out to set the record straight, but I was also perturbed at the same time because she was the one who had set the record wrong in the first place. And so you have this sense of Lindy doing that now, and that we're watching it in real time. I want to say about Jill Cement, she was under the influence of power from her husband, who's now dead. He was her first reader. He was her best friend. They shared a mythology. That's important as well. You see that in Lindy's work too. There is a mythology around Aham, that there is no one else she could possibly be with in the world, and that without him she would fall apart. And that's a strong mythology and something that is really difficult to overcome. And of course, Lindy is smart. She's self-aware. I have no doubt that she'll find her way through this. At the end of the day, I do think that her fans want what's best for her, and you're seeing that. I also wish for her that there wasn't so much hate and backlash. I think that's just something that Lindy, for whatever reason, she's a bit of a lightning rod and she seems to draw it to her, and it's one of the reasons that she's successful. But I also think that through all of that backlash, if you can look at what people are saying, I think that they really want her to be true to herself, and to be free. So we'll see where this all unfolds, even if it takes 10 or more years. I wish the best to Lindy West. Certainly, I did love Adult Braces. I highly recommend it. And if you really want to go down the rabbit hole on the online discourse, it doesn't take very much to scratch the surface and to start reading all about this story, which is, frankly, fascinating, never a dull moment in the world of memoir. Thanks, everyone.